"Your cooking is terrible," my ex-mother-in-law complained, so I invited this celebrity chef to dinner. I never thought a Tuesday night would change everything, but there I was, standing in my own kitchen, watching Margaret Pierce dissect my homemade lasagna with the precision of a coroner. She held up a forkful like evidence in a murder trial, her perfectly manicured fingers gripping the silverware with disdain. The woman had invited herself over for dinner, again using her key that my ex-husband David had given her years ago and never bothered to ask back for. Margaret had this way of arriving unannounced, sweeping through my front door like she owned the place, inspecting everything from the dust on my coffee table to the way I folded my dish towels. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Tonight was no different, except tonight she had decided my cooking was her target. She took another bite, chewed slowly, and then set her fork down with theatrical disgust. "Sarah dear," she said in that syrupy voice that made my skin crawl, "I don't know how David survived eating your cooking for 5 years. This lasagna tastes like cardboard soaked in ketchup." I stood there holding a wooden spoon, still stirring the sauce that apparently tasted like ketchup, and felt something inside me freeze. Not break, not shatter, just freeze solid. Margaret continued her critique, oblivious to the fact that I had spent 3 hours preparing this meal from scratch, using my grandmother's recipe that had been passed down for generations. "The noodles are overcooked, the meat is dry, and don't even get me started on whatever you call this sauce," she continued, gesturing dismissively at my plate. "No wonder David started eating out so much toward the end of your marriage. I would have done the same thing." That last comment hit like a slap. David had indeed started eating out constantly in the final months of our marriage, claiming he was working late or meeting clients. I later discovered he was meeting his secretary at various restaurants around town, whining and dining her while telling me he was too busy to come home for dinner. Margaret knew this. She had known about the affair long before I did, had probably even encouraged it. I tried to teach David to appreciate good food. Margaret went on, taking a sip of the wine I had opened specifically for this dinner. "I spent years showing him what real cuisine looks like. French techniques, proper seasoning, presentation that doesn't look like it came from a cafeteria. But then he married you, and well," she made a vague gesture that encompassed my entire kitchen, my entire life. I set the wooden spoon down carefully on the counter. My hands were shaking, but not from anger. From something else entirely. Something cold and calculating that I had never felt before. Margaret was still talking, something about how she had tried to be patient with my amateur attempts at cooking, how she had bitten her tongue for years out of respect for David, how she felt it was her duty now to speak honestly since the divorce was final. "I mean, Sarah, you're a lovely person," she said with false sweetness, "but cooking is clearly not your gift. Maybe you should stick to ordering takeout, at least then you won't poison anyone." She laughed at her own joke, a sound like breaking glass, and took another sip of my wine. That was the moment. That was when something deep inside me shifted permanently. I had spent 5 years married to her son, 5 years trying to win her approval, 5 years cooking elaborate meals for family gatherings, where she would pick apart every dish I made. 5 years of her helpful suggestions and constructive criticism that left me feeling inadequate and small. Even after the divorce, even after David had moved out and started his new life with his secretary, Margaret had continued her visits. She claimed she wanted to maintain a relationship with me, said I was like the daughter she never had, insisted that the divorce didn't have to affect our bond. But every visit was the same. She would arrive unannounced, criticize something about my home, or my appearance, or my life choices, and leave me feeling like I was still failing to meet her impossible standards. Tonight was different though. Tonight, as she sat in my dining room, in the chair David used to occupy, insulting the meal I had prepared with my own hands, I realized something profound. I didn't have to take this anymore. I wasn't married to her son. I didn't owe her anything. I didn't have to smile and nod and pretend her words didn't cut like knives. "More wine?" I asked sweetly, already reaching for the bottle. "Oh yes, dear, this is actually quite good. Where did you get it?" she asked, holding out her glass. "A little place downtown," I said, pouring carefully. "They specialize in wines that pair well with amateur cooking." Margaret looked at me sharply, as if trying to determine whether I was being sarcastic. I smiled blandly and returned to the kitchen to check on the bread in the oven. My hands had stopped shaking, my mind was crystal clear. I was done being her verbal punching bag. The bread was perfect, golden brown and fragrant, but I knew that if I brought it out, Margaret would find something wrong with it. The crust would be too hard or too soft, the interior too dense or too airy, the flavor too bland or too strong. There was no winning with her, and I was finally ready to stop playing her game. I had moved to Seattle after the divorce, wanting a fresh start away from the suffocating presence of David's family. But Margaret had followed, claiming she missed me too much to let distance come between us. She had purchased a condo just 20 minutes away, close enough to drop by whenever the mood struck her. She said she wanted to be supportive during my transition to single life, but her version of support involved constant criticism disguised as concern. She critiqued my decorating choices, my career decisions, my dating life, and apparently my cooking. Nothing I did was ever quite right in her eyes. When I had gotten a promotion at the marketing firm where I worked, she had wondered aloud if I was really ready for that level of responsibility. When I had started dating again, she had opinions about every man I brought around, none of them favorable. And when I had finally told her I needed some space to figure out my new life, she had guilt-tripped me into continuing our weekly dinners. "Sarah darling, you can't just shut people out because you're going through a difficult time," she had said. "I'm here to help you, to guide you through this transition. You need someone with experience to show you how to rebuild your life properly." I had believed her, or at least I had wanted to believe her. I had convinced myself that her harsh words came from a place of love, that she genuinely wanted what was best for me. But sitting there listening to her tear apart my cooking with such obvious pleasure, I finally saw the truth. Margaret didn't want to help me. She wanted to control me, to keep me small and dependent and grateful for her attention. The oven timer chimed, and I removed the bread, setting it on a cooling rack. Through the kitchen doorway, I could see Margaret examining the framed photographs on my mantel, no doubt preparing another round of commentary about my life choices. She had already made her feelings known about the pictures I had chosen to display. Too many photos of friends, not enough family. Too casual, not formal enough. The frames didn't match, the arrangement lacked sophistication. "Sarah, this bread smells lovely," she called from the dining room. "I hope you didn't overbake it like last time." Last time, there it was. She remembered every culinary misstep I had ever made in her presence, catalogued them all for future reference. She could recall in perfect detail the time I had burned the edges of a batch of cookies, or overcooked a pot roast, or under-seasoned a soup. But she never remembered the successes, the meals that had turned out perfectly, the times when even David had complimented my cooking. I sliced the bread carefully, arranging it on a wooden board with some butter and honey. My movements were deliberate and calm. I felt like I was watching myself from a distance, observing this woman who looked like me, but was somehow different. Stronger, more purposeful. When I returned to the dining room, Margaret was scrolling through her phone, apparently bored with critiquing my photographs. She looked up as I set the bread on the table and immediately reached for a slice. "At least bread is hard to ruin," she said with a little laugh, as if she were being generous by acknowledging that I might be capable of performing this one simple task correctly. I sat down across from her, and watched as she bit into the bread. Her expression changed slightly, surprise flickering across her features. The bread was actually excellent, perfectly golden and soft, with just the right amount of chewiness. Even Margaret couldn't find fault with it. "This is quite good," she admitted reluctantly, taking another bite. "Thank you," I said simply. We ate in relative silence for a few minutes, the only sound the clinking of silverware against plates. Margaret seemed lost in thought, perhaps trying to formulate her next criticism, or maybe just savoring the bread despite herself. I used the quiet time to study her face, really look at her, maybe for the first time. Margaret Pierce was 62 years old, impeccably groomed, and never seen in public without full makeup and perfectly styled silver hair. She dressed like she was attending a board meeting even when she was just going to the grocery store. Everything about her appearance was calculated to project success and sophistication. She had been married to David's father, a successful attorney, for 38 years before his death, from a heart attack 2 years earlier. Since becoming a widow, Margaret had thrown herself into various social activities and charitable organizations, but her primary focus seemed to be managing the lives of everyone around her. She had opinions about everything, and wasn't shy about sharing them. She served on the board of the local art museum, hosted elaborate dinner parties, and traveled extensively. By all outward appearances, she was living a full and meaningful life. But sitting across from her now, I could see something else. Something desperate and needy beneath all that polished exterior. Margaret didn't just offer unsolicited advice and criticism because she was naturally bossy. She did it because it made her feel important, necessary, superior. My failures made her feel better about herself. "You know, Sarah," she said, setting down her fork, "I've been thinking about your situation." My situation, as if being divorced and starting over at 32, was some kind of medical condition that required her diagnosis and treatment. "I think part of your problem is that you never learned the basics," she continued. "Your mother, bless her heart, wasn't much of a cook either. It's not entirely your fault that you lack the fundamental skills. My mother had been gone for 8 years, having lost her battle with cancer when I was 24. She had been many things: a nurse, a volunteer at the animal shelter, a woman who could make anyone feel welcome in her home. And yes, she had been an excellent cook, though she had focused more on comfort food than the elaborate French cuisine that Margaret seemed to consider the only legitimate form of cooking. I remember the meals at your wedding reception," Margaret went on, warming to her theme: simple basic food. Nothing sophisticated or memorable. I was actually embarrassed when my friends asked about the catering. The wedding reception that my parents had paid for, the one where Margaret had complained about everything from the flowers to the music to the photographer. The reception where she had spent the evening telling anyone who would listen how she would have done things differently if she had been planning the event. "But I think there's hope for you yet," she said with the air of someone bestowing a great gift. "I've been considering offering you some cooking lessons. Private instruction, one-on-one. I could teach you the proper techniques, introduce you to real ingredients, help you develop some sophistication in the kitchen." I looked at her carefully. This was her idea of generosity, her way of helping me improve my sad little life. She would graciously share her vast knowledge with poor incompetent Sarah, who couldn't even make a decent lasagna. "I could start coming over twice a week instead of once," she continued enthusiastically, apparently interpreting my silence as gratitude. "We could work on basic skills first, knife techniques, proper seasoning, sauce fundamentals. Then move on to more complex dishes as you progress." Twice a week, she wanted to double her visits, turn my home into her personal classroom, where she could demonstrate her superiority while pretending to help me. The thought of enduring that twice-weekly humiliation made my stomach turn. "That's very generous of you," I said carefully. "I think so too," she agreed, missing the careful neutrality in my tone entirely. "Most people would charge a fortune for this level of personal instruction, but I care about you, Sarah. I want to see you succeed." She reached across the table and patted my hand in what she probably thought was a motherly gesture. Her skin was cold and dry, her touch brief and perfunctory. "We could start next week," she said. "I'll bring over some proper ingredients, show you how to select quality products. Half the battle is using the right components. You can't make a good meal with inferior materials." Inferior materials. Like everything I had just served her, everything in my kitchen, everything about my approach to food and cooking and life. "I'll think about it," I said. "Don't think too long, dear. The longer you wait to address these deficiencies, the harder it becomes to correct them. Bad habits become entrenched, you know." She glanced at her watch, a delicate gold piece that had belonged to her mother-in-law, and sighed dramatically. "I should probably head home soon. I have an early meeting tomorrow with the museum board. We're planning our annual gala, and there's so much work to be done. The catering selection alone is giving me nightmares. You have to be so careful with these events. One bad meal can ruin an entire evening. One bad meal, like the one she had just finished eating at my table. Before I go though, I want to give you something," she said, reaching into her oversized purse. "I brought you a cookbook, one of my favorites. It's written by this wonderful French chef, who really understands classical techniques." She pulled out a thick hardcover book, with a glossy cover featuring an elaborate dish that looked like it required about 6 hours and a culinary degree to prepare. The title was in both English and French, and the author's photo showed a stern-looking man in traditional chef's whites. "This will give you a foundation to build on," she said, sliding the book across the table to me. "Start with Chapter 3, Basic Stocks and Sauces. Master those before you attempt anything more complex." I picked up the book and flipped through a few pages. Every recipe seemed to require ingredients I had never heard of, and techniques that looked impossibly complicated. This wasn't a cookbook for home cooks, it was a textbook for culinary students. "Thank you," I said, closing the book and setting it aside. "Use it, Sarah, really study it. I'll quiz you on it when I come back on Friday for our first proper lesson." Friday. She had already decided when our cooking lessons would begin, had already inserted herself into my week twice instead of once, had already started planning my culinary education without waiting for my agreement. I walked her to the door, helping her with her coat, and listening to her final instructions about the cookbook and the grocery list she would email me tomorrow. She kissed my cheek in that air kiss way of hers, leaving behind a faint trace of her expensive perfume, and stepped out into the cool Seattle evening. "Lock the door behind me," she instructed. "This neighborhood isn't as safe as you think it is." I closed the door and turned the deadbolt, then stood there in my foyer for a long moment, listening to the sound of her car starting and pulling away. The house felt different with her gone, lighter somehow, as if her presence had been pressing down on everything like a heavy blanket. I returned to the dining room and looked at the remnants of our meal. Half the lasagna remained in the pan, along with most of the salad and several slices of bread. Margaret had eaten very little, preferring to talk rather than consume the food she had spent so much time criticizing. I took a bite of the leftover lasagna, eating it straight from the pan with a fork. It was actually quite good. The flavors had melded nicely, the cheese was perfectly melted, and the meat sauce had just the right balance of herbs and seasonings. My grandmother would have been proud. Standing there in my quiet kitchen, eating my supposedly terrible lasagna, I made a decision. I was done with Margaret Pierce. Done with her visits, done with her criticism, done with her condescending offers of help, done pretending that her words came from a place of love when they so obviously came from a place of cruelty. But I wasn't going to tell her to stop coming over. I wasn't going to have a big confrontation or change my locks, or send her an angry letter. I was going to do something much more interesting. I was going to invite her to dinner again. One more time, a very special dinner that she would remember for the rest of her life. I spent the rest of that evening researching, planning and making phone calls. By the time I went to bed, I had put a plan in motion that would give Margaret exactly what she deserved. She wanted to judge my cooking. Fine, I would give her something worth judging. The next morning, I called her before she could call me. "Margaret, it's Sarah. I've been thinking about what you said last night, about the cooking lessons." "Oh, wonderful, dear. I knew you'd come around. When shall we start?" Actually, I had another idea. Instead of lessons, what if I cooked you a really special dinner? Something elaborate and sophisticated, using proper techniques and quality ingredients. I could show you that I'm serious about improving.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
There was a pause on the other end of the line. "Well, I suppose that could work," she said slowly. "What did you have in mind?" "A 7-course tasting menu. French cuisine, of course. Classical preparations, the works. I want to really challenge myself, show you what I'm capable of when I put my mind to it." "Sarah dear, that sounds quite ambitious. Are you sure you're ready for something so complex?" "I'm sure. And Margaret, I want to invite someone else to join us. Someone who can really appreciate good food and proper technique." "Oh, who did you have in mind?" I smiled, looking out my kitchen window at the morning sunshine. "It's a surprise. Someone very special. I think you'll be impressed." "Well, if you're certain you can handle it. When were you thinking?" "This Saturday evening. 7 o'clock, dress nicely." "Saturday it is then. I'm quite curious to see what you come up with. And this mystery guest of yours. Trust me, Margaret. It's going to be a dinner you'll never forget." After I hung up, I made another phone call, this one much more important. When the person on the other end answered, I took a deep breath and launched into the most audacious request of my life. "Hello, "Is this the booking office for Chef Antoine Dubois?" The receptionist at Chef Antoine Dubois' management company had that polished professional tone that screamed exclusive clientele and astronomical fees. I had done my homework before making this call, spending hours researching the most celebrated chefs in the Pacific Northwest, and Antoine's name kept appearing at the top of every list. He owned 3 Michelin-starred restaurants in Seattle, had written 4 best-selling cookbooks, and hosted a popular cooking show on the Food Network called Mastering the Masters. More importantly, he was known for his brutal honesty about food and his intolerance for pretentious diners who couldn't appreciate true culinary artistry. He was exactly what I needed. "I'm calling to inquire about Chef Dubois's availability for a private dinner consultation," I said, keeping my voice steady despite my racing heart. "Chef Dubois doesn't typically do private dinners," the receptionist replied coolly. "His schedule is booked months in advance, and his consulting fees start at $5,000 for a basic consultation. $5,000. I almost hung up right there, but then I thought about Margaret's face last night, the way she had dismissed my cooking with such casual cruelty, and I found my resolve. "This isn't a typical request," I said. "I'd like to speak with someone about a very specific situation. It involves food critique and professional evaluation." There was a pause, then the sound of typing. "Can you hold for a moment? Let me check with Chef Dubois' personal assistant." The hold music was some kind of classical piece, probably chosen to reinforce the sophisticated atmosphere they were cultivating. I paced around my living room, still wearing yesterday's clothes, my hair unbrushed, running on pure adrenaline and determination. "Ma'am, I have Jessica Chen on the line. She's Chef Dubois's executive assistant and handles all special requests." The line clicked, and a new voice came on, warmer but still professional. "This is Jessica. I understand you have an unusual request regarding Chef Dubois." I took a deep breath and launched into my pitch. I told her about Margaret, about years of criticism and condescension, about last night's particularly brutal assessment of my cooking. I explained that I wanted to host a dinner where my ex-mother-in-law's opinions about food could be evaluated by someone who actually knew what they were talking about. "So you want Chef Dubois to come to your home and essentially judge the judge?" Jessica asked, and I could hear the intrigue in her voice. "Exactly. I want a professional opinion about whether my cooking is actually as terrible as she claims, and I want her to hear it directly from someone whose credentials she can't question." "This is definitely unusual," Jessica said slowly. "Can you tell me more about your cooking background? What kind of meal are you planning?" I described my grandmother's recipes, my years of cooking for David and his family, the elaborate holiday meals I had prepared that Margaret had always found fault with. I explained my plan for a 7-course French menu, using classical techniques and high-quality ingredients. "And you're confident in your ability to execute this menu?" Jessica asked. "I am. I've been cooking seriously for over a decade. I took classes at the Seattle Culinary Academy as a hobby, and I've worked my way through several advanced cookbooks. I'm not a professional, but I'm not an amateur either." There was a long pause, then Jessica said something that surprised me. "You know what? This actually sounds like something Chef Dubois might find interesting. He's always saying that the biggest problem in food culture is people who think they know everything but actually know nothing. Can you send me some photos of meals you've prepared recently?" I spent the next hour digging through my phone, finding pictures of dishes I had made over the past few months. A coq au vin I had prepared for a dinner party, homemade pasta with a mushroom cream sauce, a chocolate soufflé that had turned out perfectly. I emailed them to Jessica, along with a detailed description of my proposed menu. She called me back 2 hours later. "I showed your photos and proposal to Chef Dubois," she said. "He's intrigued. Your food actually looks quite good, and he likes the idea of putting an arrogant food critic in their place. However, his fee for this kind of consultation is normally $8,000. $8,000. My stomach dropped. I had some savings, but that was a significant chunk of my emergency fund. However, Jessica continued, "Chef Dubois has a proposition. He'll do the dinner for free if you agree to let him film it for a segment on his show. He's been looking for content about home cooks who are underestimated and overlooked." This could be perfect. Filmed. The dinner would be recorded, potentially broadcast to millions of people. Margaret's humiliation wouldn't just be private, it would be public. What exactly would the filming involve? I asked. A small crew, maybe 3 or 4 people. They'd set up cameras discreetly around your dining room and kitchen. Chef Dubois would arrive as your surprise guest, evaluate the meal in real time, and give his professional assessment. The focus would be on celebrating good home cooking and calling out unfair criticism. I thought about Margaret's reaction to being filmed, to having her opinions challenged on camera by a world-renowned chef. She would be mortified, but she would also be trapped. She couldn't storm out or refuse to participate without looking even worse. When would this air? I asked. If we filmed this Saturday, it could be edited and ready to air within 2 weeks. Chef Dubois is very excited about this concept. 2 weeks. In 2 weeks, Margaret's condescending critique of my cooking could be broadcast nationally, along with a professional chef's rebuttal. The thought was both terrifying and exhilarating. I need to think about this, I said. Of course, but I'll need an answer by tomorrow morning. Chef Dubois' schedule is extremely tight, and we'd need to coordinate the crew. After hanging up, I sat in my kitchen staring at the cookbook Margaret had given me the night before. The French chef on the cover looked stern and judgmental, exactly like Margaret herself. I opened to a random page, and found a recipe for coq au vin that was almost identical to one I had mastered years ago, except with unnecessarily complicated instructions and pretentious ingredient substitutions. I pulled out my laptop and started researching Antoine Dubois more thoroughly. I watched clips from his show, read interviews, studied his approach to cooking and food criticism. What I found was a chef who genuinely cared about good food and had no patience for pretension or snobbishness. In one interview, he talked about his philosophy. The worst thing in the culinary world is people who use their supposed knowledge to make others feel bad about their cooking, he had said. Food is about nourishment, comfort, bringing people together. When someone uses food as a weapon to attack or diminish others, they've missed the entire point. That sealed it for me. I called Jessica back that evening. I'm in, I said. Let's do it. The next few days were a whirlwind of preparation. Jessica sent me a detailed production agreement to sign, along with guidelines for the filming. The crew would arrive at 5 o'clock on Saturday to set up equipment. Chef Dubois would arrive at 7, just as Margaret was expected. I was to introduce him as a friend who was joining us for dinner, and the rest would unfold naturally. I spent Wednesday and Thursday shopping for ingredients, visiting 3 different specialty stores to find everything I needed for my planned menu. I had decided on 7 courses that would showcase different techniques and flavor profiles. Amuse-bouche of goat cheese mousse, with honey and thyme. Pan-seared scallops with cauliflower puree and pancetta crisps. Butternut squash soup with brown butter and sage. Duck breast with cherry gastrique, and roasted fingerling potatoes. A palate cleanser of lemon sorbet. Beef tenderloin with red wine reduction, and roasted vegetables. And finally, chocolate lava cake with vanilla bean ice cream. Each dish required careful timing and precise technique. I spent Friday doing prep work, making stocks, preparing components that could be done in advance. I cleaned my house from top to bottom, polished silver, pressed linens, arranged flowers. Everything had to be perfect. Margaret called Friday evening to confirm Saturday's dinner. I'm quite curious about this mystery guest of yours, she said. Anyone I might know? You'll recognize the name, I said truthfully. I think you'll be very impressed with their credentials. Well, I do hope you're not in over your head with this elaborate menu. 7 courses is quite ambitious for someone at your skill level. I'm confident it will be memorable, I replied. I'm bringing that wine you liked so much from last time, she said. And I'll try to keep an open mind about your cooking, though I hope you understand that I have to be honest about what I taste. I'm counting on your complete honesty, I said. That's exactly what I want. Saturday afternoon, I started cooking. The beef went into a low oven to slowly roast. The duck breasts were scored and seasoned. Vegetables were prepped and ready for roasting. The chocolate cakes were baked and turned out perfectly, each one hiding a molten center that would flow when cut. At exactly 5 o'clock, 3 people arrived with camera equipment. They were surprisingly unobtrusive, setting up small cameras in strategic locations around my dining room and kitchen. The lead cameraman, a quiet man named Tom, explained that they would capture everything but remain invisible during the actual dinner. "We've worked with Chef Dubois many times," he said. "He's very good at making people forget the cameras are there. Just act naturally, and we'll take care of the rest." At 6:30, I went upstairs to change clothes. I had chosen a simple black dress, elegant but not overdressed, paired with pearls that had belonged to my mother. I wanted to look confident and competent, like someone who belonged in the same room as a world-famous chef. At exactly 7 o'clock, Margaret's car pulled into my driveway. I watched through the window as she climbed out, wearing a navy blue cocktail dress and her signature pearls. She carried a bottle of wine and what looked like a small gift bag, probably some kitchen gadget she thought I needed. The doorbell rang, and I took a deep breath before answering. Margaret stood on my porch, looking perfectly composed, her silver hair styled in an elegant updo, her makeup flawless despite the December cold. "Sarah, darling, you look lovely," she said, kissing my cheek and stepping inside. "Something smells absolutely divine. What is that aroma?" "Duck and herbs," I said, taking her coat. "Dinner should be ready soon." She handed me the wine and the gift bag. "A little something to help with tonight's ambitious menu," she said with a knowing smile. I looked inside the bag, and found a digital meat thermometer, still in its packaging. "I thought this might help you avoid overcooking the protein courses," she explained. "Proper temperature control is so crucial with fine dining." Fine dining. She was already positioning herself as the expert, the teacher, the one who would evaluate my efforts and find them wanting. "That's very thoughtful," I said, setting the thermometer aside. "Can I get you something to drink while we wait for our other guest?" "Other guest? They're not here yet. They should arrive any moment. They texted that they were running just a few minutes late." Margaret settled into my living room with a glass of the wine she had brought, commenting on the table setting I had prepared. "The flowers are lovely, and I do like these plates. Are they new?" "They belong to my grandmother," I said. "I thought tonight deserved the good china." "How nice. Your grandmother had excellent taste. Though I might have chosen a different wine glass for this particular vintage." Before I could respond, the doorbell rang again. Margaret looked toward the front door expectantly as I went to answer it. I opened the door to find Chef Antoine Dubois standing on my porch, looking exactly like his television appearances, but somehow more intimidating in person. He was tall and lean, with salt and pepper hair, and intense dark eyes. He wore a perfectly tailored charcoal suit, and carried a small leather portfolio. "Sarah," he said with a slight French accent, extending his hand. "It's a pleasure to meet you." "Chef Dubois, thank you so much for coming," I replied, shaking his hand and stepping aside to let him enter. Behind me I heard Margaret's wine glass hit the coffee table with a sharp clink. "Chef Antoine Dubois," she said, her voice climbing an octave. "The Antoine Dubois." He turned toward her with a polite smile. "Good evening. You must be Margaret. Sarah has told me quite a lot about you." Margaret stood up so quickly she nearly knocked over her wine, her hand flying to her throat in a gesture of surprise. "I had no idea. Sarah, you didn't tell me." "I wanted it to be a surprise," I said smoothly. "Chef Dubois, this is Margaret Pierce. She's quite the food connoisseur herself." "Ah, wonderful," he said, moving toward her, with that confident stride that had made him famous. "I always enjoy meeting fellow food enthusiasts. Sarah tells me you have very strong opinions about cooking." Margaret's face had gone pale beneath her carefully applied makeup. She was clearly struggling to process this development, to figure out how this internationally famous chef had ended up in my modest dining room.
"Yes, I do enjoy good food," she managed. "I'm just so surprised. How do you two know each other?" Chef Dubois glanced at me with an almost imperceptible wink before answering. "Sarah reached out to my office about tonight's dinner. She wanted a professional opinion about her cooking abilities. Apparently there's been some disagreement about her skills in the kitchen." The color that had drained from Margaret's face came rushing back in a wave of red that crept up her neck and into her cheeks. She understood now what was happening, what I had done.
Her eyes darted between Chef Dubois and me, calculating, trying to figure out how to handle this unexpected turn of events. "Well," she said slowly, "I'm certainly honored to have such a distinguished guest at dinner. Though I have to say, Sarah, this does seem like quite an elaborate way to handle our little discussion about cooking techniques." "Our little discussion," Chef Dubois repeated thoughtfully. "Yes, Sarah mentioned that you've been offering her some feedback about her culinary efforts. I find that fascinating, actually. I'm always curious about how people evaluate food, what criteria they use, what their background is." He settled into the chair opposite Margaret, crossing his legs casually. "Tell me, what's your culinary training? Did you attend cooking school, work in restaurants, study under any particular chefs?" Margaret's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. She had been put on the spot by one of the most respected figures in the culinary world, and she clearly hadn't prepared for this line of questioning. "Well, I've been cooking for my family for over 30 years, she said finally. "I've traveled extensively, eaten at some of the finest restaurants in Europe and Asia. I have a very educated palate." "Ah, so you're self-taught through experience and observation," Chef Dubois said, nodding. "That's quite respectable. Some of the best home cooks I know learned exactly that way. And you've been mentoring Sarah, helping her develop her skills." The word mentoring hung in the air like a challenge. Margaret clearly recognized the trap, but couldn't figure out how to avoid it without looking worse. "I've tried to offer some constructive guidance," she said carefully. "Sarah is still developing her technique." "I see. And what specific areas have you identified for improvement?" Margaret glanced at me, then back at Chef Dubois. She was trapped between her usual pattern of criticism and the presence of someone who actually knew what he was talking about. "Well, seasoning can be an issue. And technique, proper cooking temperatures, presentation." Chef Dubois murmured, making a note in his leather portfolio. "Those are certainly fundamental areas. I'm very interested to taste tonight's meal and see how Sarah handles those challenges." I excused myself to check on dinner, leaving Margaret alone with Chef Dubois in my living room. From the kitchen I could hear the murmur of their conversation, his questions and her increasingly nervous responses. The cameras were capturing every moment, every subtle expression, every telling pause. The first course was ready. I arranged the goat cheese mousse on small spoons, drizzled with honey and garnished with fresh thyme. The presentation was elegant and professional, exactly the kind of amuse-bouche you might find at a high-end restaurant. When I returned to the living room carrying the tray, both Margaret and Chef Dubois looked up expectantly. Margaret's expression was wary now, no longer the confident critic from our previous dinners. "Our first course," I announced, offering each of them a spoon. Chef Dubois examined the amuse-bouche carefully before tasting it, noting the color, the garnish, the balance of components. He took a bite and chewed thoughtfully, his expression neutral but professional. Margaret hesitated before trying hers, clearly aware that her reaction was being watched and evaluated. She took a small bite, and her eyebrows rose slightly in surprise. "This is quite good," Chef Dubois said after a moment. "The goat cheese is perfectly seasoned, the honey adds just the right touch of sweetness, and the thyme provides a lovely herbal note. Very well balanced." He turned to Margaret. "What's your assessment?" Margaret looked down at her spoon, then back up at Chef Dubois. For the first time in years, she seemed genuinely uncertain about what to say. "It's very pleasant," she said finally. "The flavors work well together." "Pleasant," Chef Dubois repeated, making another note. Interesting choice of words. I might have described it as sophisticated, well executed, restaurant quality. But pleasant works too. Margaret's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. She was beginning to understand that this evening wasn't going to unfold the way she had expected. I served the second course, the pan-seared scallops with cauliflower puree. The scallops were perfectly caramelized on the outside and tender within, the puree was silky smooth, and the pancetta crisps added the perfect textural contrast. Chef Dubois took a bite and actually smiled. "Excellent sear on these scallops, perfect caramelization without overcooking. The cauliflower puree is restaurant quality, very smooth texture, this is professional level execution." He looked at Margaret expectantly. She took a bite, chewed slowly, and I could see the internal struggle playing out across her features. The food was undeniably good, but admitting that would undermine everything she had said about my cooking. "The scallops are adequately prepared," she said finally. "Adequately?" Chef Dubois looked genuinely puzzled. "I'm curious about that assessment. These scallops are textbook perfect. What specifically would you change about the preparation?" Margaret stared at her plate, realizing she had painted herself into a corner. She couldn't criticize the technical execution without revealing her own lack of knowledge, but she couldn't praise it without contradicting her previous dismissal of my abilities. "I suppose they're fine," she said quietly. "Fine," Chef Dubois repeated, his tone growing cooler. "I'm beginning to see an interesting pattern in your evaluations." The evening continued with each successive course, and with each dish, Margaret's position became more untenable. The butternut squash soup was velvety and perfectly seasoned. The duck breast was cooked to a perfect medium rare with crispy skin, and accompanied by a cherry gastrique that balanced sweet and tart flavors beautifully. The beef tenderloin was fork tender with a red wine reduction that would have been at home in any fine dining establishment. With each course, Chef Dubois offered detailed professional praise for the technique, seasoning and presentation, and with each course, Margaret's responses became more strained and defensive. "I have to say, Sarah," Chef Dubois said as we finished the main course, "this has been an exceptional meal. Your technique is sound, your flavors are well balanced, and your presentation is quite professional. I'm curious where you developed these skills." Before I could answer, Margaret finally snapped. "Oh please," she said, setting down her fork with unnecessary force. "Let's not pretend this is some kind of miraculous transformation. Sarah's cooking has been mediocre at best for years. One decent meal doesn't change that." The room fell silent. Chef Dubois set down his own fork, and turned to study Margaret with the intensity of a scientist, examining a particularly interesting specimen. "Mediocre," he said slowly, "that's a strong word. Can you explain to me what makes this meal mediocre in your professional opinion?" Margaret's face had turned a deep shade of crimson that clashed terribly with her navy dress. She opened her mouth, then closed it, clearly realizing that any answer she gave would expose her complete lack of culinary knowledge to someone whose opinion actually mattered in the food world. "I think perhaps we should move on to dessert," she said weakly, attempting to deflect from Chef Dubois' pointed question. "Oh no," he said with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "I'm genuinely fascinated by your perspective. You see, in my 30 years of professional cooking, I've encountered many food critics, both professional and amateur. The good ones can articulate exactly why a dish succeeds or fails. They understand technique, flavor profiles, texture, presentation standards. So please enlighten me. What specifically makes this meal mediocre?" The silence stretched uncomfortably. Margaret glanced toward the kitchen, toward the door, anywhere but at Chef Dubois' expectant face. I could see her mind racing, trying to find a way out of this trap she had walked into so confidently. "Well, the seasoning could be better," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "The seasoning," Chef Dubois repeated, pulling out a small notebook and pen from his jacket pocket. "Interesting. Can you be more specific? Too much salt, not enough, wrong herbs, unbalanced spice combinations." Margaret stared at her plate, like it might provide the answers she desperately needed. "It's just not quite right." "I see. And the cooking temperatures? You mentioned those were an issue in Sarah's previous meals." "Yes, the temperatures are problematic." Chef Dubois cut a piece of the beef tenderloin and held it up. "This is cooked to exactly 130 degrees Fahrenheit, which is perfect medium rare for this cut. The duck was 135 degrees, which is ideal for duck breast. The scallops were seared at high heat for precisely 90 seconds per side. These are textbook temperatures. What would you have done differently?" Margaret's hands were shaking now. She reached for her wine glass and took a large gulp, clearly stalling for time. "I just think someone with more experience would have made better choices," she said desperately. "More experience," Chef Dubois mused, making notes. "Tell me about your experience. Have you ever worked a professional kitchen, cooked for large groups, studied under any notable chefs?" "I've hosted many dinner parties," Margaret said, lifting her chin with a faint echo of her usual arrogance. "Dinner parties, how lovely. And the largest group you've cooked for?" 12 people, for the museum board." 12 people. And what did you serve?" Margaret's confidence crumbled further. "I had it catered.
The admission hung in the air like a confession. Chef Dubois stopped writing and looked up at her with genuine amazement. You had it catered. So you've been critiquing Sarah's cooking for years, but you yourself don't actually cook for groups larger than what? Your immediate family. I cook plenty, Margaret said defensively. I just believe in using professionals for important events. Of course, very sensible, but then how exactly are you qualified to judge Sarah's technique, seasoning and temperature control? The question hit like a physical blow. Margaret's mouth opened and closed silently. She had spent years positioning herself as an authority on food, and now that authority was being systematically dismantled by someone who actually possessed the credentials she had always pretended to have. I excused myself to prepare the final course, leaving them alone again. In the kitchen I could hear Chef Dubois continuing his gentle but relentless questioning. Where had Margaret learned to identify proper seasoning techniques? What cookbooks did she recommend for advanced sauce work? Which culinary schools produced the best trained chefs in her opinion? Each question revealed another gap in her knowledge, another area where her confidence exceeded her competence. I arranged the chocolate lava cakes on dessert plates, dusting them with powdered sugar and adding small quenelles of vanilla bean ice cream. The cakes were perfect, their centers molten and rich, exactly as they should be. When I returned with dessert, Margaret looked defeated. Her perfectly styled hair showed signs of stress, and her lipstick had been worried away from nervous sips of wine. Chef Dubois, by contrast, looked energized, like a professor who had discovered a particularly interesting case study. "Ah, dessert," he said as I set the plates down. "Sarah, these look restaurant quality. The plating is quite professional." He cut into the cake with his spoon, and the molten chocolate flowed out perfectly. He tasted it thoughtfully, his expression growing more impressed. "Outstanding. The exterior has a perfect crust, while maintaining the liquid center. The chocolate is high quality, the temperature control was flawless. This is advanced technique, executed beautifully." Margaret took a reluctant bite of her own cake. Despite everything, I saw her eyes widen slightly at the taste. Even she couldn't deny that this was exceptional. "It's fine," she said automatically, then seemed to realize how foolish that sounded. "Fine," Chef Dubois repeated for what must have been the 10th time that evening. "Margaret, I have to ask you something directly. Have you actually tasted Sarah's cooking before tonight?" "Of course I have. Many times. And it was genuinely bad. Poorly seasoned, overcooked, badly presented." Margaret shifted uncomfortably in her chair. "Well, it wasn't.
It could have been better. Could have been better how, specifically? It didn't meet my standards. Your standards. Based on your extensive culinary training and professional experience in the food industry." The sarcasm was gentle but unmistakable. Margaret finally seemed to realize that she was being recorded, that this conversation would be preserved and potentially broadcast. Her public humiliation was being documented in real time. "I think there's been a misunderstanding," she said, her voice growing smaller. "I never claimed to be a professional chef." "No, but you've been acting as one," Chef Dubois said firmly. "You've been evaluating and criticizing Sarah's cooking as if you had the authority to do so. You've been undermining her confidence and dismissing her abilities based on what, exactly? Your personal preferences." "I was trying to help," Margaret whispered. "Help," Chef Dubois said, closing his notebook with a sharp snap. "Let me tell you what I see here tonight. I see a woman who has been systematically tearing down another woman's confidence in the kitchen, criticizing skills that are actually quite advanced and positioning herself as an expert when she clearly lacks the knowledge to make such judgments." He leaned forward slightly, his voice taking on the authority that had made him famous. "Margaret, Sarah's cooking tonight was exceptional. Not good for a home cook, not adequate for an amateur. Exceptional, period. The technique was flawless, the seasoning was perfect, the presentation was professional grade. Any chef would be proud to serve this meal in their restaurant." Margaret's eyes filled with tears, though whether from embarrassment, anger, or genuine remorse was impossible to tell. "Furthermore," Chef Dubois continued, "the idea that you would discourage someone with this level of skill from cooking, that you would make them doubt their abilities, is frankly offensive to me as someone who cares about food and the people who prepare it." The room fell silent except for the barely audible hum of the cameras that Margaret had clearly forgotten were there. She sat frozen in her chair, her dessert untouched, her hands clenched in her lap. "Sarah," Chef Dubois said, turning to me with a completely different expression, warm and encouraging. Have you ever considered culinary school, professional training, because you have real talent here? I've thought about it, I said honestly, but I was told I wasn't good enough to pursue it seriously. By whom? He asked, though we all knew the answer. I was led to believe my skills were inadequate for anything beyond basic home cooking. Chef Dubois shook his head sadly. What a waste that would have been. You have instincts, technique, and clearly a passion for the craft. Don't let anyone convince you otherwise. He stood up and extended his hand to me. Thank you for an exceptional evening. This has been one of the best home-cooked meals I've had in years. Margaret finally found her voice. Chef Dubois, I think perhaps you're being overly generous. Sarah is improving, certainly, but, he turned to her with an expression that could have frozen fire. Margaret, with all due respect, your opinion on culinary matters carries no weight with me whatsoever. You've demonstrated tonight that you lack the knowledge, experience, and palate to evaluate anyone's cooking. The words hit like a slap. Margaret recoiled physically, her hand flying to her throat. I've been cooking for 35 years, she said desperately. And in those 35 years, have you ever served a meal this sophisticated? Have you ever executed these techniques? Have you ever created these flavor profiles? She didn't answer because we all knew she couldn't. I'll be featuring this dinner on my show, Chef Dubois announced. As an example of exceptional home cooking and the importance of recognizing real talent when we see it. Margaret's face went white. On television, yes, along with a discussion about the difference between constructive culinary criticism and uninformed negativity that serves only to tear people down. You can't do that, Margaret said, panic creeping into her voice. I didn't agree to be on television. Actually, you did, I said quietly, speaking for the first time in several minutes. When you walked through that door tonight, you agreed to participate in whatever happened here. Margaret looked around the room as if seeing it clearly for the first time. Her gaze landed on the discreetly placed cameras, finally registering their presence. You set me up, she breathed. No, I said calmly. I invited you to dinner and asked a professional chef to evaluate our conversation about my cooking. Everything that happened here tonight was your choice. But I didn't know, you didn't know you'd be held accountable for your words. You didn't expect anyone to question your expertise. You thought you could continue tearing me down without consequences. Margaret stood up abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. I'm leaving. Of course you are, Chef Dubois said mildly. That's what people do when they're confronted with their own behavior. I don't have to listen to this. No, you don't. But everyone else will when this airs. Margaret grabbed her purse and coat, her movements jerky and desperate. At the door she turned back for one last attempt at regaining control. Sarah, you'll regret this, making a fool of me.
Yay!
In front of cameras, embarrassing me like this. We're family. No, I said firmly. We're not family. We haven't been family since your son and I divorced. We're just two people who shared some meals, and now we won't be doing that anymore. You can't cut me out of your life. Watch me. Margaret slammed the door behind her, and I heard her car start with angry revving of the engine. Through the window I watched her taillights disappear down the street. Chef Dubois was putting away his notebook, smiling with what looked like genuine satisfaction. That, he said, was even better than I hoped. We got everything we needed. The camera crew began packing up their equipment, moving efficiently around the dining room. Tom, the lead cameraman, approached me with a grin. This is going to make incredible television, he said. The look on her face when she realized she was being filmed. Priceless. After everyone left, I sat alone in my dining room, surrounded by the remnants of what had been the most satisfying meal of my life. Not because of the food, though that had been genuinely excellent, but because of what it represented. I had taken control of my own narrative, refused to accept someone else's definition of my worth, and found my voice in the most dramatic way possible. My phone buzzed with a text from Jessica, Chef Dubois's assistant. Chef wanted me to tell you he meant every word tonight. He'd like to discuss some opportunities with you when you're ready. Opportunities. The word felt foreign and exciting. For the first time in years I had possibilities ahead of me instead of just obligations and criticisms. I poured myself the last of the wine Margaret had brought and raised the glass in a solitary toast. To new beginnings, to standing up for myself, and to the most expensive revenge dinner in culinary history. Margaret's voice echoed in my memory from just an hour earlier. Your cooking is terrible. Now the whole world would get to decide for themselves who was right. The episode aired on a Thursday evening 2 weeks later, during prime time. I had received an advance copy from the production team, but watching it broadcast nationally felt surreal. Chef Dubois had titled the segment Hidden Gems. When home cooks outshine their critics, and the editing was masterful. They opened with shots of my kitchen, the careful preparation, the professional plating techniques. Chef Dubois provided voiceover commentary about the technical skills required for each dish. Then came Margaret's arrival, her confident stride into my dining room, her immediate assumption of authority. The cameras had captured everything. Every dismissive comment, every condescending smile, every moment when she realized she was out of her depth. The editors had been particularly clever in juxtaposing her criticisms with Chef Dubois' professional praise. When Margaret called the scallops adequately prepared, they immediately cut to his assessment: textbook perfect, restaurant quality execution. The climax came when Chef Dubois systematically dismantled Margaret's credibility. The cameras caught every micro-expression, every nervous gesture, every telling pause. When she admitted to having her dinner parties catered, the audience could practically feel her authority evaporating in real time. Social media exploded within hours. #terrible cooking began trending, but not in the way Margaret might have expected. Viewers were using it sarcastically, praising home cooks who had been similarly dismissed by self-appointed food experts. Food bloggers wrote lengthy posts about the difference between constructive criticism and destructive negativity. Cooking forums buzzed with discussions about recognizing real culinary skill. Margaret herself became an instant meme. Screenshots of her increasingly panicked expressions were shared thousands of times, usually captioned with variations of, "When you realize you're not the expert you thought you were." The moment when she admitted to catering her own dinner parties was particularly popular, spawning countless jokes about fake food critics. But the response that mattered most to me came from unexpected places. Professional chefs began reaching out through social media, offering encouragement and advice. Culinary schools sent information about their programs. Food Network executives expressed interest in potential collaborations. Most importantly, home cooks across the country shared their own stories. Messages poured in from people who had been discouraged by family members, friends, or self-proclaimed experts. They thanked me for showing that sometimes the critics are wrong, that confidence in the kitchen comes from skill and practice, not from someone else's approval. Margaret's reaction was swift and predictable. She called me the morning after the episode aired, her voice shaking with rage. "You've humiliated me in front of millions of people," she said without preamble. "Do you have any idea what you've done? I invited you to dinner and let you speak for yourself." I replied calmly. "Everything the audience saw was your own words and behavior. I trusted you. I thought we were family. You thought you could continue treating me like your personal punching bag without consequences. You were wrong. My friends are calling asking if I really said those things. The museum board is questioning my judgment. People are laughing at me. Maybe they're finally seeing what I've been dealing with for years. I could sue you for this. For filming me without my knowledge. For making me look foolish. Go ahead. I have excellent legal documentation that you consented to being filmed. And as for looking foolish, that was entirely your own doing." She hung up without another word. Within days, Margaret's social circle began distancing themselves from her. The museum board quietly suggested she might want to step down from her leadership position. Her regular lunch companions suddenly became unavailable. The elaborate dinner parties she was known for were cancelled indefinitely. Meanwhile, my life transformed in ways I never could have imagined. Jessica called with an offer from Chef Dubois himself. He wanted me to appear as a guest on his cooking show, demonstrating some of the techniques I had showcased during our dinner. The segment would focus on elevating home cooking to professional standards. "Chef Dubois rarely makes offers like this," Jessica explained. "He was genuinely impressed with your skills and your story. He thinks you have something valuable to teach other home cooks." I accepted immediately. The filming took place in Chef Dubois' state-of-the-art television kitchen, and working alongside him was like a master class in culinary artistry. He was patient, encouraging, and generous with his knowledge. More importantly, he treated me as a peer, not a student. "You have real instincts," he told me during a break in filming. "That's something that can't be taught." Technique can be learned, but instinct is innate. The episode featuring my cooking lesson received even higher ratings than the original dinner segment. Viewers responded enthusiastically to the idea that exceptional food could come from home kitchens, not just professional restaurants. The Food Network offered me a development deal for my own show, focusing on sophisticated home cooking techniques. But perhaps the most satisfying response came from an unexpected source. David, my ex-husband, called 3 weeks after the episode aired. "Sarah, I saw the show," he said, his voice carrying a note I had never heard before. "It might have been respect. Did you? I had no idea you could cook like that. Those dishes looked incredible." "I've been cooking like that for years, David. You just never paid attention." There was a long pause. "My mother said some pretty harsh things about your cooking over the years. I guess I believed her." "Your mother said harsh things about everything I did, and you let her." "I know. I'm sorry about that. And I'm sorry about how everything ended between us. It's in the past now." That chef, he really put her in her place, didn't he? He simply asked her to explain her qualifications. She did the rest herself. "She's not handling the attention very well. She's barely leaving her condo. Won't answer calls from most people. That's unfortunate, but it's not my problem anymore. I guess I understand why you did it." She could be pretty brutal with her opinions. Could be. "David, she spent 5 years tearing me down at every opportunity, and you never once defended me." "Not once. I know. I should have stood up for you." "Yes, you should have, but you didn't, and now it's too late for apologies. Is there any chance we could?" "No, there isn't. We're done, David. We were done the day you chose your secretary over your wife, and we're still done now." I hung up feeling lighter than I had in months. The people who had dismissed and diminished me were finally seeing the consequences of their actions, while I was building something new and exciting. The cookbook deal came next. A major publisher approached me about writing a book that would bridge the gap between home cooking and professional techniques. They wanted recipes that were sophisticated enough to impress dinner guests but accessible enough for everyday cooks to master. "Your story resonates with so many people," the editor explained during our first meeting. "Home cooks who have been made to feel inadequate, people who love food but have been told they're not good enough. You represent the possibility that excellence can come from unexpected places." I signed the contract that afternoon. Margaret made one final attempt to contact me, sending a handwritten letter that arrived on a Tuesday morning. The envelope was cream-colored and expensive, her return address embossed in elegant script. Inside, her familiar handwriting covered 2 pages of matching stationery. She began with apologies, claiming she had been misunderstood, that her intentions had always been to help me improve. She explained that the stress of recent events had affected her health, that she was seeing a therapist to work through her communication issues. She asked for forgiveness, for a chance to make amends, for the opportunity to rebuild our relationship. The letter was carefully crafted, designed to make me feel guilty for her current situation. She painted herself as a victim of circumstances, a well-meaning woman who had been unfairly portrayed by clever editing and malicious intent. I read it twice, then fed it through my paper shredder. That weekend, I received a different kind of letter. This one came from the Seattle Culinary Academy, offering me a position as a part-time instructor. They wanted me to teach a course called Advanced Home Cooking Techniques, for serious amateur cooks looking to elevate their skills. "Your television appearances have generated tremendous interest," the director wrote. "Students are specifically asking for classes taught by you. We believe your unique perspective, combining professional-level skills with a home cooking background, would be invaluable to our program." I called them immediately to accept. 3 months after the dinner that changed everything, I was living a completely different life. My cookbook was in development, my television show was in pre-production, and my teaching position at the Culinary Academy had a waiting list of students. Food and Wine magazine featured me in their Rising Stars section, calling me the home cook who proved that excellence knows no boundaries. Margaret, meanwhile, had become a cautionary tale. Food bloggers used her as an example of toxic food culture, the kind of destructive criticism that stifles creativity and discourages experimentation. She had become the face of everything wrong with culinary elitism, the person who represented the worst aspects of food snobbery. The irony was perfect. She had spent years positioning herself as a culinary authority, and now she was indeed known nationally for her food opinions. Just not in the way she had intended. My phone rang one evening as I was testing recipes for the cookbook. It was Jessica from Chef Dubois' office. "I have something interesting to share with you," she said. "We've been approached by several production companies about creating a show based on your dinner story. They want to make it a series where home cooks get to challenge their critics with the help of professional chefs." "Really?" "The concept is called Prove Them Wrong. Each episode would feature someone like you, a talented cook who's been underestimated, getting the chance to demonstrate their skills to the people who doubted them. And you think there are enough people in situations like mine to fill a whole series? Sarah, you'd be amazed how many people have reached out to us since your episode aired. Apparently the world is full of Margaret Pierces, and there are a lot of talented cooks who are tired of being told they're not good enough." I thought about all the messages I had received, all the stories people had shared about being discouraged by family members, friends, or supposed experts. Maybe it was time to help others find their own voices in the kitchen. "Tell them I'm interested," I said. As I hung up the phone, I looked around my kitchen, the same space where Margaret had delivered her final cruel assessment of my cooking. The room looked exactly the same, but everything had changed. I was no longer the woman who sat quietly while someone else defined her worth. I was a chef, a teacher, a television personality, and an author. Margaret had been right about one thing. That dinner had indeed been memorable. Just not in the way she had expected. I opened my laptop and began working on a new recipe, one that would appear in both my cookbook and my upcoming television show. I decided to call it Vindication Soup, and I already knew it was going to taste absolutely perfect. 1 year later, I stood in my new test kitchen, overlooking the Seattle waterfront through floor-to-ceiling windows. The space was everything I had dreamed of. Professional-grade equipment, abundant natural light, and enough room to film my cooking show while developing recipes for my second cookbook. The first book had exceeded all sales expectations, becoming a bestseller within 3 months of release. Prove Them Wrong had been picked up for a second season after the first episode shattered viewership records. Each week we helped talented home cooks confront the people who had undermined their confidence, always with the assistance of respected professional chefs. The format had spawned international versions in 6 countries. My phone buzzed with a text from Jessica. "Margaret Pierce just applied to be a contestant on the show. Thought you should know." I stared at the message then laughed out loud. Even now, Margaret couldn't resist trying to insert herself into my success story. The application would be rejected, of course. The show focused on lifting up talented cooks, not providing platforms for people seeking redemption tours. A knock at the kitchen door interrupted my thoughts. My assistant Kim poked her head in with an apologetic smile. "Sorry to bother you, but there's someone here to see you. Says she's family." My stomach dropped. I had moved 3 times in the past year, partly for larger spaces but also to maintain privacy. Very few people had this address. "Did she give a name?" "Lindsay Pierce. She says she's your former sister-in-law." Lindsay, David's sister, had always been the family member I got along with best, though we hadn't spoken since the divorce. I nodded to Kim and walked to the front entrance of the building. Lindsay stood in the lobby looking nervous but determined. She had always been the quiet one in David's family, overshadowed by Margaret's strong personality and David's natural charm. At 35, she was a successful accountant with her own practice, but around her family, she seemed to shrink into herself. "Hi Sarah," she said, her voice tentative. "I hope it's okay that I came by. I got your address from David's assistant." "It's fine. What brings you here?" "I wanted to talk to you. About what happened. About my mother." I gestured toward the elevator, and we rode up to my kitchen in silence. Lindsay's eyes widened when she saw the space, taking in the professional equipment and the camera setup in the corner. "This is incredible," she said. "You've really made something amazing here." "Thank you. Can I get you some coffee?" "That would be nice." I prepared coffee using beans from a local roaster I had featured on the show, grinding them fresh and using the precise water temperature that Chef Dubois had taught me. Even simple tasks had become opportunities to practice technique. I watched the episode, Lindsay said as we settled at the small table where I did my recipe testing. The dinner with my mother. I figured most of your family had seen it by now. Sarah, I owe you an apology. Several apologies, actually. I sipped my coffee and waited for her to continue. I knew how she treated you. During your marriage to David, I saw how she criticized everything you did. The way she made you feel small at family gatherings. I should have said something. Why didn't you? Lindsay stared into her coffee cup. Because I was afraid she'd turn that criticism on me. I've been dealing with her my whole life, and I learned early that it was easier to let her focus her negativity on someone else than to become the target myself. The honesty was refreshing, even if the admission was painful to hear. I was a coward, she continued. I let you become her scapegoat because it kept me safe. When she was tearing apart your cooking or your decorating or whatever, she wasn't commenting on my weight or my career choices or my dating life. And now she barely speaks to anyone. The museum board asked her to resign. Most of her social circle has distanced themselves from her. She spends most of her time at home, ordering takeout and watching cooking shows. Watching cooking shows, yours specifically. She's seen every episode of Prove Them Wrong multiple times. She has your cookbook. She even tried making one of your recipes last month. The image of Margaret attempting to recreate one of my dishes was both amusing and somehow tragic. How did it turn out? Terribly. She called me crying because she couldn't get the sauce right. Lindsay shook her head. For the first time in her life, she was facing the reality that cooking is actually difficult, that the things she criticized you for required real skill. Is that why you're here? To ask me to forgive her? No, I'm here to ask you to forgive me. And to tell you that what you did, standing up to her like that, it changed things for all of us. I raised an eyebrow, curious. David finally started seeing her clearly. He told me he spent years thinking you were too sensitive about her comments, that you should have just ignored her. But watching that episode, seeing how she couldn't back up any of her criticisms with actual knowledge, he realized how wrong he was. A little late for that revelation. I know, but he's been different since then. More aware of how his mother affects people. He even started standing up to her when she criticizes his girlfriend. He has a girlfriend. The secretary thing didn't last long. He's dating a teacher now, someone really nice. And when my mother started in on her usual routine about this woman's appearance, her job, whatever, David shut it down immediately. Good for him. He's not the only one. I started seeing a therapist after watching your episode. I realized I've spent my entire adult life modifying my behavior to avoid my mother's criticism. I was 40 pounds overweight because I stress ate every time she made comments about my appearance. I was dating men I didn't really like because they met her approval. I was living my life in her shadow. Lindsay pulled out her phone and showed me a photo of herself from a recent hiking trip. She looked healthy, confident, genuinely happy in a way I had never seen during the years I knew her. I lost the weight, ended a relationship that was going nowhere, and started doing things I actually enjoyed instead of things she approved of. Watching you refuse to accept her treatment showed me that I didn't have to accept it either. I'm glad you're doing better. There's something else. I applied for your show. You applied for Prove Them Wrong. I'm a good baker. Really good. I've been making elaborate cakes and pastries since I was 12. But every time I brought something to a family gathering, my mother would find something wrong with it. Too sweet, too dense, too simple, too fancy. She convinced me I was just an amateur playing around in the kitchen. What kind of baking do you do? Lindsay's face lit up as she described her passion for French pastries, her experiments with complex flavor combinations, her weekend projects creating multilayer cakes that were works of art. As she talked, I could see the enthusiasm she had been forced to hide for years. I'd like to open a bakery someday, she said. But I kept telling myself I wasn't good enough, that it was just a hobby. After seeing what you accomplished, how you turned your skills into a career, I started thinking maybe I was wrong about my own abilities. Who would be your critic on the show? My mother, obviously.
She's the one who needs to hear that her opinion doesn't define my worth. I thought about the application Jessica had mentioned, Margaret's attempt to appear on the show. Perhaps this was a better approach. Lindsay, what if I helped you directly? Not on the show, but privately. I could introduce you to some pastry chefs, help you develop a business plan, maybe feature your work on my own show. Her eyes filled with tears. You would do that, after everything my family put you through? You're not responsible for your mother's behavior, and everyone deserves the chance to pursue their passion without someone else's negativity holding them back. We spent the next 2 hours going through Lindsay's photos of her baking creations. Her work was genuinely impressive, technically complex, beautifully presented, and clearly made with real skill and creativity. She had been hiding extraordinary talent because one person had convinced her it wasn't worth sharing. As she prepared to leave, Lindsay hesitated at the door. "Sarah, can I ask you something? Do you ever regret it? What you did to my mother?" I considered the question carefully. In the year since that dinner, Margaret had lost her social standing, her position of authority, and most of her relationships. Her fall from grace had been swift and complete. "No," I said finally. "I don't regret it. Your mother spent years using her supposed expertise to tear people down. She made me doubt myself, made me feel inadequate, convinced me that my efforts weren't worth anything. She did the same thing to you, and probably to countless other people. But she's completely isolated now. She has no friends left. That's the natural consequence of treating people badly for decades. I didn't destroy her relationships. I just stopped allowing her to destroy mine." Lindsay nodded slowly. "You're right, I guess I still feel guilty sometimes for not protecting her." "Lindsay, you spent your entire life protecting her. You protected her by staying quiet when she hurt other people. You protected her by being the perfect daughter who never caused problems. You protected her by sacrificing your own happiness to keep her comfortable. And what did that get me?" "Exactly, it's time to protect yourself instead." After Lindsay left, I returned to my kitchen and continued working on recipes for the new cookbook. But my mind kept drifting to Margaret, alone in her condo, watching my cooking shows and attempting my recipes. There was something poetic about her final transformation from critic to student, even if she would never acknowledge the reversal. My phone rang, interrupting my thoughts. It was Chef Dubois. "Sarah, I have wonderful news. The James Beard Foundation wants to present you with their media award for your work promoting home cooking excellence. The ceremony is next month in New York." The James Beard Award. It was the highest honor in the American culinary world, recognition that my work had made a meaningful impact on food culture. Margaret, for all her pretensions to culinary knowledge, would never achieve such recognition. As I hung up the phone, I realized that the woman who had once sat in my dining room, dismissing my cooking as terrible, had inadvertently created something beautiful. Her cruelty had forced me to prove my worth, leading to opportunities I never could have imagined. Sometimes the best revenge is simply becoming everything your critics said you couldn't be. I opened my laptop and began typing the acknowledgements page for my second cookbook. I wanted to thank Chef Dubois, my editor, my television crew, and all the viewers who had shared their own stories of overcoming kitchen critics. But I didn't mention Margaret by name. She had already played her role in my story, and now it was time to write new chapters without her. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.